see the presentation. And I would also like to invite any of you who may like to share a live online presentation with your colleagues, just to reach out to myself or to June, and we can work on arranging this. And I'm going to ask that June put up both of our emails so that you have the ability, if you are interested in having more of a personal training for you and your colleagues, that you have the opportunity to do so. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Betsy Lowe, who will be introducing our speakers. Again, please turn off your video and make sure you're muted.
Hello, everyone. We're so glad you've chosen to join us. I'd like to introduce Ashlyn and Kyler. Ashlyn Swartz is a PhD candidate of public health at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She is a project manager for the youth development and evaluation activities on a community-based research opioid use disorder grant. Ashlyn utilizes mixed methodological approaches in addressing youth and perinatal health challenges related to substance use. Since 2017, Ashlyn continues her research on developmental outcomes related to childhood trauma and neonatal abstinence syndrome. Kyler Groner is a senior at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's pursuing a bachelor's degree in economics and philosophy of science and medicine with a minor in public policy analytics. Kyler is from Morristown, Tennessee, and he is passionate about youth empowerment, poverty elimination, and health justice. Without further ado, I would like to turn the meeting and training over to Ashlyn and Kyler. Thank you all.
Okay, hello everyone. Can everyone see the screen? Thumbs up. Well, I guess the videos are off, so I'm assuming everyone can see the screen. But thank you for joining our presentation. We're excited to speak with you today about some topics that are essential to understanding as individuals who have the opportunity to be youth leaders and working with youth. And we hope that by learning about brain development and its intersection with trauma, that you can have some clear, usable resilience-based strategies to utilize within your role in youth. And we would like to thank the Health Resources and Service Administration for funding to be able to give this presentation today. As an overview today, we're going to start talking about brain growth and development, go through what adverse childhood experiences are, and then Kyler's going to discuss resilience-based strategies and developmentally appropriate strategies. And this coincides with our learning objectives, which are to describe basic processes and critical periods of brain development, to identify how adverse childhood experiences impact behavior and brain development, and lastly, to define resilience and identify trauma-informed resilience-building strategies to work with youth. So to get started, we wanted to put a little icebreaker in here. And since there are a lot of individuals that are joining, we realize everyone can't speak, but we would like to know in the chat, specifically, since we've already kind of done an introduction, what age groups do you primarily work with, and what do these experiences usually look like when you're interacting or teaching with youth? So if you could just put in the chat a blurb, you know, early childhood, adolescence, one-on-one group settings. Kyler and I are going to try to take your lived experience, because we think there's a lot of power within that, to try to shape some of the material that we discuss and go into more detail with today. So we have some adolescents and older adults coming through, early childhood, awesome, teens. Okay. Adolescence. Seems like the most common thread so far. Early adolescence, awesome. Social work, internships, elementary, middle school, group settings. Okay, well, thank you guys for participating. I see some answers are still coming through the chat. It really seems like we're working all across the lifespan for the most part with youth. So I think Kyler and I will have some great material to share with you guys. So the brain is organized in a hierarchical way, and brains are built over time from the bottom up. The basic architecture of the brain is constructed through this ongoing process. It begins before birth and continues all the way through adulthood. So we start with simple neural connections and skills first, and then we follow with more complex skills and more complex circuits. So what we can kind of see in this image and what happens with brain development is that brain development begins with the brainstem, which is this yellow part on the image, then is followed by the limbic system, the screen aspect, and lastly, the cortical part of the brain develops, which is shown in blue. So like climbing a ladder, if you have no foundational support, you're not going to be able to go very far. And brain development is similar as it develops in this evolutionary way for survival. So the first area of the brain, as we discussed, that develops is this primitive brain, the brainstem. And this is what is responsible for keeping us safe. It's our really basic functions if you're thinking about balance, breathing, anything that's autonomic that we aren't even considering that we're typically doing. This is the part of the brain that makes us run away from danger. It's our fight or flight resource, and it keeps us also alive. So then our brain development after this primitive stage, it continues to the limbic system. And this is where attachments are being formed, emotions and behaviors are also being controlled. And then this cortical region that develops is responsible for this higher level thinking, this abstract thinking, learning, inhibition, these complex tasks that actually separate us from most other primates. And the brainstem is very helpful. So this first part that's developing for a child that's living in a dangerous environment. The brainstem will constantly be on high alert, be ready to keep the child safe and prevent them from danger. And it does this job extremely well. But this can be a problem for traumatized children, as that if they are able to transition into a safe environment, the primitive brain does not turn off. So the children or the child is constantly staying in this survival mode. We can see that with these types of children that are constantly in this fight or flight survival stage, that everyday normal events signal danger to their brain. So a child can get kind of developmentally stuck in this first section of brain development. So little information can really get passed up more or less through the other parts of the brain. And so if a child's stuck in this unsafe environment or this traumatic state, they aren't going to be able to form secure attachments, manage their emotions, manage their behavior, and then even getting to that later stage to think, learn, or reflect, because they're simply trying to survive and stay alive. So that key message from this is that since the brain is developing from the bottom up, if the bottom, we aren't in a safe, healthy environment, we aren't going to be able to then learn. And since academic learning happens in this cortical region, if proper brain development isn't happening, it's like that ladder. It can have many negative developmental milestones. So as youth champions and youth leaders, it's essential to try to provide a safe environment in the classroom. And this is essential for relationship building, for learning to be able to take place. And so always try to remember to emphasize safety as we remember that the brain develops in this hierarchical fashion. In the first few years of life, more than 1 million new neural connections form every second. I don't know about you guys, but this statistic just blows my mind. So more than 1 million new neural connections every second. And this is going through really the first 5 years of life, mainly in the first 3 years. So early childhood and adolescence are known as these periods of rapid brain development. They're known as windows of opportunity and vulnerability. And so after this period of rapid proliferation of cells, the connections are then reduced through a process called pruning. This is when this allows brain circuits to become more efficient. And so pruning is this really incredible process where the brain gets rid of connections that it deems useless and strengthens the connections that it actually needs. So just imagine like you're pruning dead leaves off a tree. Our brain does similar things. For example, the learning that took place to come out of the birth canal, if that's not going to be used again, the brain's going to get rid of those neurons and that learning. You might have experienced this if you've ever tried to learn a new language or perhaps play an instrument, and then years later come back and realize that maybe your brain has actually pruned some of these connections if you haven't been strengthening them and utilizing them. So as facilitators working with youth, we have this incredible opportunity to contribute to these developmental periods of rapid brain growth. So imagine all these new neural connections are forming, and you have this chance to influence what's going to be sticking in their brain. What are you reinforcing, or how are you forming relationships, etc. So we have to really think in mind as youth leaders during these periods about the way we are talking and interacting with youth to strengthen the connections that are going to be important. So in the cortical region of the brain, which was that third area of the brain development we talked about, is where the prefrontal cortex lies. And this is the area of our brain that's responsible for our goal-oriented, directed behaviors. It's responsible for long-term planning, complex decision-making, logic, impulsivity, many things that are essential for complex situations in life. And this could be studying an exam, time management, etc. In this area, the brain is actually developing through about age 25. So while we're working with youth, this is important to know that a lot of these higher level functioning tasks are not completely developed. For instance, early adolescent will not be able to process information and be as quick and succinct as even an older adolescent. And the prefrontal cortex is an incredible feature in the brain, and it really separates us from most other primates. And if you really think about the way different species are born, humans are actually born very premature compared to other primates where we are completely dependent on a caregiver when we're born. And this allows for, again, a lot of vulnerability and a lot of opportunity. And that's why some of the first 5 years of life are so critical for brain development, because environment influences humans so much more than other species, because we are having all this brain development within these first years. So as briefly mentioned, there are two main critical periods of brain development. And this is early childhood and adolescence. I hope if nothing else, this sticks, that these are times that as youth leaders, we really want to try to do our best to really get involved with youth in a positive way and support youth development. So this is when a child's brain is developing in spurts, meaning there are a lot of new synapses, which are pretty much connections, if you think about learning, that are developing. And so learning is happening at a very accelerated rate. And this is a limited span of time during which youth are very sensitive to external stimuli and are capable of acquiring certain skills. Brain plasticity, which is pretty much, if you think of something being fluid or very rigid, it's a time where the brain is really open to learning and adapting and changing. And this is maximized during these windows of opportunity as the number of the brain synapses in the brain is doubling. So after these critical periods, the brain becomes less plastic and less adaptable. And the transition actually from this plastic to a more fixed state is advantageous because it allows for more sequential consolidation and retention of more complex perceptual, motor, and cognitive functions. However, experiences in these phases can have lasting effects on development. If a sensory experience is abnormal or absent during this time, it can have profound effects on different representations all the way through adulthood and the lifespan, resulting in adaptations that can make it nearly impossible to learn certain skills. So as I mentioned, these critical periods are periods of opportunity and vulnerability. And there are a few historical events that have led scientists to understand how crucial these critical periods are for brain development. And yes, I saw a thing come through the chat. We can get a copy of that PowerPoint. When the Romanian regime fell in 1989, there were these horrible conditions that emerged by the nations of 100,000 orphans finally came to light. The communist state had banned both abortion and contraception, and this caused birth rates to rocket. Unfortunately, a lot of parents cannot afford families of more than 5 children, and there were many abandoned children that were left in these orphanages where they were often drugged and suffered severe neglect and abuse. When the first journalists sent back pictures, they showed malnourished or disabled youngsters. Some were tied to their cribs and others were hobbling because they had never been allowed to even get out of their cots and they had never learned how to walk. So these rescued youngsters were found to be socially, emotionally, and mentally impaired with poor language skills because they had suffered severe brain damage. And what we can see in this image is the brain of a healthy child and an abused child in the Romanian orphanage. We have the picture of the healthy brain on the left and the abused child on the right. And what we can see within these two white circled areas on the image, this is the image in the area of the temporal lobe, which is in control of our emotions and self-regulation. As you can see, not only is there less neural activity in the abused brain, but the temporal lobe didn't even develop. So that blows my mind that during these windows of opportunity, our brains really need this environmental stimuli for development to occur. And if the stimuli isn't present, the development is completely skipped. So thus, exposure to neglect during the first years of life can trigger physiological changes in the brain. And we can see that here, the effect of trauma changing architecture of the brain. And children then cannot learn to regulate their emotions if they're living under this constant toxic stress. And the temporal lobes regulate our emotions, but early childhood experiences also influence how well these brain areas will be developed and connected to other brain regions. And there's one other historical event that has happened. This is an individual that kind of goes through critical periods being skipped. And this is Jeannie's story. And her story came to light in the 1970s in Los Angeles and California. A social worker discovered a 13-year-old girl after her mother had sought out services for her own health. Jeannie's life prior to her discovery was one of complete, utter deprivation. She spent most of her days tied naked to a potty chair, only being able to move her hands and feet. And when she made a noise, her father would beat her. Her father, mother, and older brother rarely spoke to her. And the rare times her father did interact with her, it was a bark or a growl. So despite Jeannie, when she was rescued, scoring the level of a 1-year-old, on initial assessment, she quickly began adding new words to her vocabulary when working with specialists. She started by learning single words and eventually began putting 2 words together, much the way a young child would. After a year of treatment, she even started putting 3 words together occasionally. In children that are experiencing normative language development, this stage is followed by what is known as language expulsion, where children rapidly acquire new words and begin putting them together in novel ways. But unfortunately, this never happened for Jeannie. Her language abilities remained stuck at this stage, and she appeared unable to apply grammatical rules and use language in a meaningful way. At this point, her progress leveled off and her acquisition of language completely halted. So thus, as Jeannie didn't have exposure to language development in this critical brain development period, she was never able to acquire language. So I just discussed 2 different cases of missing critical brain periods of development and the intersection of trauma. So we need to go through and clarify in general how trauma is talked about a lot in the literature. And you guys may have heard of adverse childhood experiences. This is getting more commonly, I think, spoken about, and more trainings are on this. So adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, are traumatic or stressful events that occur in the first 18 years of life. And they typically fall into 3 categories, as we can see on the image. of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. And this household dysfunction category has really changed with research and has added a lot more different categories from even peer influences as well. But typically this is something that could be substance misuse in a parent, it could be parental separation, mental health challenges, etc. And pretty much what happened, the CDC, there's this hallmark study by the CDC, Kaiser Permanente, and this study was conducted in the late 1990s with a lot of two waves of data collection. About 17,000 health maintenance organization members from Southern California received physical exams and completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences and their current health status and behaviors. And this hallmark study really opened the door for pathways for scientists to realize the impact of childhood trauma and its relationship with many negative health outcomes. So adverse childhood experiences can have lasting negative health effects on well-being, as well as life opportunities, even from job opportunities to education. And these negative childhood experiences increase the risk of injury, sexually transmitted infections, maternal and child health problems, and a wide range of chronic diseases that can then start a cascade leading to increased likelihood of early death, and even increased risk of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, mental health challenges, including suicidal ideations. So adverse childhood experiences are associated with social determinants of health. To expand a little, individuals that are living in under-resourced or racially segregated neighborhoods have an increased likelihood to sometimes experience more ACEs. Also frequently moving or individuals experiencing food insecurity, and all these things can cause toxic stress. And the toxic stress from ACEs can change brain development, as we've seen in some of these images before, and affect things such as attention, decision-making, learning, and even our response to stress can completely change from living under a toxic stress environment. And so individuals and children that are growing up with toxic stress may have a difficulty forming healthy and stable relationships. It all goes back to that first image, which, if there's that stress and you can't form attachments and you can't think. So there's all these cascades that can happen. And these effects can even actually be transgenerational and passed down to other children. So it's really important as youth workers to understand these different types of traumas and the impact it can have. But we are also going to go through strategies that you guys can take knowing this information to apply. And lastly, on ACEs, it is important to know that they are actually common. In this hallmark study, about 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states reported that they had experienced at least one type of ACE. And nearly 1 in 6 reported that they had experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. And they also cluster typically, meaning that if one person's experienced abuse, they're more likely to also maybe have household dysfunction or neglect. And what is very concerning too is that when ACEs do group or cluster, there's an exponential increase of these negative health outcomes and cascades that can come. So for those who have experienced ACEs, there are a range of possibilities and responses that can help individuals. And this can include therapeutic sessions, mental health professionals, things like meditation, physical exercise, or spending time in nature, etc. The ideal approach, however, is to try to really prevent adverse childhood experiences as much as we can. And this can be from reducing sources of stress in people's lives, meeting basic needs, or providing other services. So sometimes as a youth worker, we might have to think if a child is in an unsafe situation, what can we do to make their life more simple and make their basic needs be met so that they can be in a healthy place to learn. So in fostering strong, responsive relationships between children and their caregivers and helping children and adults build core life skills can help buffer a child from the effects of toxic stress and really empower them and hopefully lead them to be more resilient, which is what Kyler's about to talk about in a minute. And to end my section on a little lighter note, because I know I've gone through some negative aspects of what can happen from our environmental stimuli and how it influences our brain, it is important to know that the brain is very adaptable to not only negative environments, but also positive environments. And as we've talked about, this could be relationship building. The exercise or the example I'm going to show is through physical activity. And what we're seeing is another brain imaging scan. And this is a result of a research study that involves 7 to 9-year-olds who are randomly assigned to a 9-month after-school physical activity program or a waitlist control. And after 9 months, the fitness, cognitive performance, and executive functioning skills, so that prefrontal cortex region that we've talked about of children that were in this physical activity group had improved much more than the children in the control. And we can see that too, even just an increased amount of colors in the brain on the right. And so this is really important just to remember as youth look up to our teachers, really trying to know that we can help in a positive way and you can play a large role and can make a difference. So Kyler's going to go through and discuss resilience with you to help understand what we can do with some different situations in your classrooms or in your settings. And here is, I've talked a little too much. I get excited about this topic, so I think I might have rambled a little, but here's a really wonderful video I'd recommend. It's 4 minutes. I don't think we'll have time to get to it today to watch on your own. It summarizes this material if you ever need to teach it or just want a synopsis in a really great visual fashion.
All right, awesome. So Ashlyn just gave us a really awesome overview of kind of the neuroscience behind ACEs and childhood trauma and how it affects people. But we didn't want to just leave you with that, right? We didn't want people to think that, there's nothing we can do. We need to just throw in the towel. This is kind of how it is. So the second part that we want to talk about is resilience. And the good news is that there has been plenty of research that there actually are concrete strategies that we can implement to try to mitigate some of the negative impacts of trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So first we want to go over what resilience is. Resilience is the process of overcoming the negative effects of risk exposure. It's coping successfully with a traumatic experience, and it's avoiding some of those negative trajectories associated with risk that we talked about with ACEs and traumatic experiences, placing people at increased likelihoods of going on to develop substance use disorders, a mental health issue, be justice involved, things like that. And so it requires both risk and promotive factors. We're going to go over that in a little bit. Promotive factors are going to be assets and resources for people. So community, people who are there to support you. And it's also going to involve a level of healthy risk taking that's going to increase confidence and increase the ability for people to be able to go on and face hardships in the future. Resilience continued. So one thing we want to point out is that resilience is not some type of innate characteristic possessed by some people, but not others. It is not coping with your problems independently or independent of anybody's help. And it's not dealing with a traumatic event without any type of emotional pain or distress. Instead, resilience involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that anybody can learn and develop. All right, so there have been many types of positive trauma-informed youth mental health preventions, and there's quite a bit of research on that. And they've actually been shown to be beneficial for all children, regardless of whether they're considered at risk or not. And a lot of this is pretty intuitive because if you are teaching young people to be resilient and kind of fostering that environment where young people are kind of building their resilience, then they're going to be better equipped to face any type of challenges in the future regardless of whether or not they have a traumatic past. But it's going to be especially beneficial for students who might have one or more adverse childhood experiences. Another thing is that positive mental health promotion and resilience building programs, they've been linked to reducing the likelihood of those negative outcomes that we talked about. So they increase academic achievement, but they're also going to reduce the likelihood of things like going on to develop a substance use disorder, being arrested or incarcerated in the future, things like that. One thing that I do want to note before we go on is that while there is a lot of different research on this, a lot of it is observational, and a lot of these mental health preventions for young people and resilience building programs is that they're going to differ from place to place. It's going to be unique to the needs of the students, the culture, the community, the setting. So what might work in Campbell County might look very different implemented in Knoxville or Chattanooga. But there are kind of some overarching themes and some characteristics of successful resilience building programs and interventions that we're going to go through. So one thing that we also want to recognize is that trauma is often cyclical. So whenever a young person or really anybody experiences a traumatic event, this places them at an increased risk of going on and having, behavioral problems such as developing a mental health issue or a substance use disorder, which then places them at higher risk for things like being involved in the justice system, experiencing some type of violence or things like that. And this often leads to being re-traumatized. And so one thing that we want to avoid with students, with young people, is re-injury and re-traumatization. And so the way that we do that is we recognize trauma and its triggers, and we avoid kind of stigmatizing and punishing students for what may be a trauma response. All right, so here we're going to get into some of the overarching themes of successful trauma-informed strategies for working with young people. The first thing is going to be to reframe and reimagine disciplinary approaches. So on the previous slide, we talked about how trauma is often cyclical. And one way that it's often cyclical is that trauma leads young people to develop behavioral issues that they're then punished for. So there's evidence showing that if a young person is expelled or suspended from school, that it significantly increases their likelihood of dropping out or being arrested or incarcerated in the future. And so you can see how that kind of re-traumatizes them, puts them at kind of risk for re-injury. So what we want to do is we want to reframe and reimagine how we are disciplining our students. So how we do that is we balance accountability with an understanding of traumatic behavior. We're going to teach students the school and the classroom rules, but we're also going to reinforce that the school is a nonviolent place. So some of the young people might be kind of accustomed to violence or anger at home, and we want to get rid of that as much as we can in the environment that we're creating for our young people. This next one is a big one for me, is motivating students through an understanding of what's right and what's wrong, not motivating them just by fear of punishment. We don't want to just incentivize behavior through fear. We want to incentivize it because they have an actual understanding of what is right and what is wrong. And so I'm sure that a lot of us have already seen literature or studies addressing the impacts of physical punishment with children. So things like spanking young people and things like that is generally frowned upon today, which is good because we have a lot of research showing that all it does is worsen behavioral problems. It's associated with increased likelihood of developing a mental illness later in life. And typically in the long run, it just doesn't solve any issues. It usually makes them worse. But one surprising thing is that shouting or yelling at students or young people has actually recently been shown to have a lot of similar effects. So shouting at young people is shown to, in the long run, exacerbate behavioral problems, been linked to developing certain mental health conditions later in life. And so basically, we don't want to be punishing students by showing anger towards them. We want to have safe, predictable, and consistent consequences. And we'll get into that, the predictable and the consistency later in some of the next slides. All right, so structure, routine, and predictability. So all students can benefit from some type of predictability or structure. And what that's going to do is that's going to reduce their anxiety and reduce their fight or flight response. And so one of the best examples that I can come up with to illustrate this is to imagine when you were a young person, or maybe even today, of kind of being scared of the dark. So if I imagine myself and I'm, let's say, out in the woods and it's like pitch black outside, you know, my fight or flight response is going to be activated. And so you might think, you know, well, why is that? And a big reason why is because it's unpredictable, right? If it's dark outside, I don't know what's in front of me. I don't know if there's, you know, a bear 10 feet in front of me or not. So I'm going to be on edge. I'm going to be scared. I'm going to have that kind of anxiety and that stress. And so similarly, young people, if they're in, you know, a very unstructured, chaotic environment where they don't know what's going to happen next, that can be a source of anxiety and stress. And so if we think about students who have had a traumatic past specifically, those young people, their brains are already kind of primed to expect bad things to happen. And so if they're placed in an environment that's unpredictable, then, or kind of chaotic, they don't know what's going to happen next, then that's going to trigger that fight or flight response. That's going to trigger that fear, and it's going to make them more likely to act out and have behavioral problems. It's going to make it more difficult for them to learn. And so the way that we counter that is we create a predictable routine, a schedule where they know exactly what's going to happen next. And so this is going to make them feel much safer. The next one is just opportunities to foster positive relationships. So students who have a traumatic background, they might have a heightened mistrust of others. And so offering spaces to facilitate friendships and positive relationships can really help to rebuild that trust and establish an uplifting community. And this is just really intuitive. I mean, if you think back about any type of hardship that you've had to go through in your life, you know, maybe the hardest thing that you ever had to deal with, and how you got through it, the way you got through it was likely due to other people around you, due to relationships that you had with friends, with family, with people supporting you. And it's really important that we recognize and facilitate those positive support systems for young people as well. The next one is going to be unconditional positive regard. And so what that is valuing a student regardless of their behaviors, of their actions. I really like this quote down at the bottom, accepting people as they are instead of as I wanted them to be. And so examples of this is using personal greetings, remembering and using a student's name, positively acknowledging them, praising them in public, but correcting them in private, and encouraging their peers to uplift one another. And so what we can see is that a lot of times students or young people with a traumatic background, they might struggle with saying things like self-confidence, self-worth. And so in our environments, we want to try our best to counter that. Okay, so another thing is incorporating breaks. So normalizing asking for breaks provides a tool for students to practice emotional self-regulation. One thing that I think is really interesting is the idea of sensory breaks. So there's kind of some mixed findings about this in the studies that we've looked at. But what we do know for certain is that people who have experienced trauma often have an increased likelihood of struggling with kind of sensory things. So kind of the classic example, if you think of someone with PTSD, certain kind of sensory experiences might be triggering or kind of traumatic for them. And so there's been kind of some interesting things in schools where there's been certain kind of sensory items implemented to try to help students kind of deal with that and cope through that. And we're going to go through some examples kind of in the next slide. But I think that's really interesting, offering students ways to kind of have a break from their environment if it seems like they're kind of getting kind of overloaded. So here's some examples of what I was talking about. So certain schools have implemented these chairs. A lot of times they're called wobble stools, but basically if a young person is having trouble kind of sitting down and being still, these stools allow them to kind of move around, things like that. There's little kind of items like this on the top right for young people to kind of play with. Down here at the bottom left, we have another kind of balance thing. And then the bottom right, a lot of times, fluorescent lighting might be really harsh. So they actually make these special covers to put over them at schools and at youth settings and things like that. So next is engaging community and families. So we really don't know what type of home life a lot of times young people have, but a lot of times engaging their family or their caregivers can really help to kind of facilitate a positive relationship. And it kind of just helps you to see into their life and just to get people involved. So examples of this, you might write notes to home, you might put on an event with the young people and invite the community, invite the families there. But it's just a way to foster this positive connections and those positive relationships. Finally, this one's really important, is promoting healthy risk-taking. So healthy risk-taking is going to build confidence and it's going to better equip young people to cope with challenges. I like to think of this a lot of times kind of like weightlifting. So you first start weightlifting and maybe you're bench pressing, a certain amount of weight. Over time, it feels like that weight gets lighter, and it's because you're kind of exposing your muscles to that stress, and in response, they grow and the weight feels lighter. And that's kind of the same way that resilience building works. So we kind of expose young people to healthy challenges in kind of a positive and controlled environment. And once they overcome those challenges, it builds confidence, increases their self-esteem, and it better equips them to be able to go on and deal with challenges in the future. And I know we didn't watch that video. We might have some time at the end, but I definitely encourage everyone to watch that Building Brains video because it talks about the difference between positive stress and then toxic stress. So positive stress might be a young person kind of being a little bit anxious to give a presentation to their classmates, or maybe a little bit stressed about studying for an exam, or anxious about maybe how they're going to perform in school or in a sporting activity or something like that. Whereas toxic stress are those adverse childhood experiences. And that positive stress is really going to increase their capacity for resilience, increase their critical thinking skills, increase their confidence. So here down at the bottom, I have some examples. I think that public speaking or performances is a great way to do this. Young people and adults alike, they often get really nervous about this, but kind of repeated exposure to this is a great way to build confidence and kind of promote that healthy risk-taking. Setting any type of individual goals or challenges, whether that be academic, or maybe if the young person is involved in sports, or maybe just in their personal life, anything like that. And introducing them to new social settings. This is often a place of anxiety for many people, or a place of positive stress. But a young person might be anxious to join a new club or a new group. And so this can really promote some positive resilience building. So we also want to recognize that the strategies that we use need to be developmentally appropriate. So we need to integrate the young people's social and cultural context. I already kind of mentioned this earlier, to ensure the relevance and the meaning. And we want to utilize examples that are going to be simplistic enough, that's going to be kind of out at their developmental level, and also that are going to be kind of relatable. So here's an example at the bottom. Explaining to the young people that our brains are like sponges, just like a sponge can soak up water, our brains can expand based off of our environment. This can be positive or negative. And so we want to cater to the interests of the young people. We want to cater to kind of their reading level, their kind of developmental maturity, things like that. And on the next slide, I have a really good example of this. So last summer, I worked as an AmeriCorps member at a nonprofit here in Knoxville. And I worked at a youth program at a transitional housing neighborhood that was mostly for single mothers. And so a lot of the young people at this program, they had experienced, one or more ACEs. They were mostly from, single parents and things like that. So Helen Ross McNabb Center had actually partnered with this neighborhood, and every week they would send a youth health educator to come in and basically lead a positive mental health promotion kind of resilience building activity. And so I really like this one. It's one that kind of stuck out to me. So I'm sure everyone's probably played Kerplunk before, but that's what it utilizes is this game. And so you set up the jar, and then you have the little sticks that go in there. And everyone in the room, all the young people and the adults can participate too, they all have one of the marbles in their hand. And so the marble is supposed to represent a stressor. And so you call on all the people kind of individually, and they come up, and you say, what's something that stresses you out, or what's something that, makes your life difficult. And they can share it or not share it if they don't want to. But they say something that, stresses them out. It might be school, family, whatever. And you say, okay, you've said your thing, now drop your marble into the jar. So once everyone has kind of gone around and they've all put their marbles into the jar, you go around again and you ask all the young people, okay, what do you do when you're stressed out? Or what do you do after you've had a hard day? And they might say things like, well, I talk to my sister, or, well, I go on a run, or I go play basketball, or I start drawing. And hopefully they're positive things, and you can kind of differentiate between those with the young people. But for every kind of coping outlet that they say, everything that they do to cope with their stress, they come up and they pull out one of the sticks. And so eventually, once enough people have kind of pulled out a stick representing a coping outlet, the marbles start to fall through the bottom. And so the idea is that before, when all the marbles were at the top, it showed kind of stress accumulating, how it can weigh on us. And once the marbles kind of fall through the bottom, it shows kind of that weight being lifted off of us, and kind of how we've successfully coped with stress. And the idea is that the more kind of coping outlets that you have, the better equipped you are to deal with hard challenges. And so this was directed towards a middle school and elementary school audience. And it just went really well. So I was really kind of impressed by it. So I thought that I would include it in this presentation as well. So we also have some resources at the end. We're going to send out this PowerPoint to everyone who attended today. But these are just resources for youth programming, for resilience building, for positive mental health promotion. We have the National Center of Intensive Intervention as tools and resources for students. We included this because it also has COVID-19 specific resources. Luckily, most people are getting vaccinated, things are opening up, but we're kind of still dealing with a lot of the reverberating impacts that the pandemic has had on our young people. The second one is the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning. It has some really good practices and programs similarly. And the next, the CDC actually has kind of a guide for preventing adverse childhood experiences that we definitely recommend people check out. We have another video here. I don't think that we'll have time to look at it. All right, awesome. So here's just our take-home messages. So brain growth and development. This is from Ashland's section. The brain develops from the bottom up, and providing a safe environment and promoting relationships are essential for positive youth development. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that's responsible for higher level decision-making and critical thinking, is still developing in high school students. It's not fully developed until the age 25. Adolescence is a second window of opportunity. Adverse childhood experiences, they shape brain development and behavior. They're very common and they cluster, and they're linked to negative health outcomes. But there are things that we can do to buffer against those health outcomes, and that deals with resilience building. And so trauma-informed resilience building strategies, they're beneficial to all young people, regardless of whether those young people are considered at risk or not. These strategies have been shown to reduce the risk of substance use, incarceration, and improve academic achievement. This last one just summarizes a lot of the main strategies. Creating structure, routine, and predictability, along with unconditional positive regard and opportunities to foster positive relationships are characteristics of successful resilience building strategies. All right, we have our evaluation right here. I'll drop this in the chat. See, Ashlyn, do you have anything you want to add before we drop the evaluation?
Not, and I think Kyler, you did such a good job. I would just, if the audience has any questions, or not even questions, if you have any strategies that you have utilized that we didn't cover that you would like to share with us, we'd love to hear those as well. So any lived experience or questions, the floor is open.
I have a question. My name is Cindy Monk. I'm with CASA. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Cindy.
Okay. My question is, we're talking about building resilience with children, but is there an age where they're just too young for these types of things? I mean, I know we can develop social atmospheres that are positive and that, like a 4-year-old, for instance, is that somebody that's more of a challenge as an individual because of their age, or?
I definitely think that these strategies can apply to pretty much any age group. So I can imagine, even if we're working with a group of young people who are mostly, 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds or things like that, we can still implement the idea of, unconditional positive regard. We can still offer opportunities for them to overcome challenges in controlled environments. Of course, it has to be kind of developmentally appropriate. And so it's going to be kind of unique to the young people in the setting that they're in. Does that answer your question, or do you have any?
Yeah,
That
Cindy,
answer?
go ahead, Cindy.
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to add to that it is indeed possible at younger ages. And my reflection is when I was working with autistic toddlers, and actually there is something called the developmental therapist who can work with younger children in order to think through what some of the traumas they might be exposed to. So in this case, if a young person has a hard time with physical contact or getting close to people, you might, for example, put the puzzle piece on your shoulder. So they have to get close to you in order to get the puzzle piece to put the puzzle together, or to put it closer to you on the floor and then gradually moving it closer so that they can develop, as Kyler was saying, that scaffolding, so that they may be physically touched or reassured in some way as they are developmentally moving up toward that point. So I think your point is really well made, and thinking through what are some of these protective factors and how can we enhance them in order to buffer the impact of that trauma on the young person's life. So in thinking through what are some of the challenges that you might be seeing, or some opportunities that a young person might be missing out on because they have fear or resistance of involvement, and then stepping back and thinking, how do we build up to that? And that's where the creativity has to come into play, of being very intentional and very specific. And again, as Kyler mentioned, these little games that we can play with physical proximity to young people are good for all young people. They can all have fun in finding pieces. And eventually maybe you hide it under your hand, so they actually have to lift your hand up in order to find that puzzle piece. So thinking creatively about how to developmentally appropriately address some of these concerns and scaffold it up to get to your goal.
That's
Thank
very
you very
good
much.
point.
Well, thank you everyone so much. And thank you, Dr. Meshi, for chiming in. I agree, there's no age too young to start with small goals and work towards scaffolding, especially as we remember that synapses and the brain is doubling at that period. We can really get the most bang for our buck in that time and make it a time of opportunity. I want to thank everyone for all your time today. If you have any questions, Kyler and I are happy to respond via email or provide more resources. And we hope this was useful for everyone, and thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And if I can ask Ashlyn for you to save the chat, and we might share that also via email with the attendees so that they can see who they shared the event with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashlyn,
Yes.
did you get my chat?
Oh gosh. Sorry, I've got in a lot of chats at the same time. I might have missed yours. Do you want to send it again, or do you feel comfortable
I'll just tell
asking?
you what it is. So my internet decided it was going to quit on me. So I've been gone for like 10 minutes. But I was wondering if I could still count this as field hours, because this is why